announcing the arrival of Honorable Datuk Sri Anwar Ibrahim and Professor John Esposito, accompanied by other distinguished guests. Please rise.
How are you? Huh? Yeah. I have this one problem. Yeah.
Please be seated. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. May I invite everyone to recite the Ummul Kitab Al-Fatiha. Praise be to Allah, the cherisher and sustainer of the worlds, and blessings be upon our Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, his family and his companions. Honorable Datuk Sri Anwar Ibrahim, Member of Parliament for Port Dickson, Honorable Professor Emeritus Dr. John Esposito, Georgetown University, Honorable Professor Emeritus Tan Sri Datuk Zulkifli Abdul Razak, Rector of the International Islamic University Malaysia, Distinguished Professor Datuk Dr. Usman Bakar, Sheikh Al-Kulliyah ISTAC IIUM, Excellency Ambassadors and Honorable Guests, distinguished speakers, members of the media, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Good evening and welcome to the opening forum of the International Seminar on Contemporary Islamic Thought and Societal Reforms. Tonight, we are excited to be in the presence of two very distinguished speakers, Honorable Datuk Sri Anwar Ibrahim and Professor John Esposito. So without further delay, I am pleased to invite distinguished Professor Datuk Dr. Usman Bakar, Sheikh Al-Kulliyah of ISTAC, to deliver his welcome remarks, followed by an introduction on the two prominent speakers.
Thank you. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and a very good evening to everyone. Our distinguished guest panelists of tonight's forum, Yang Berhormat Datuk Seri Anwar Ibrahim, the Member of Parliament for Protection, our University Professor, Dr. John Esposito of Georgetown University in the United States, to the members of the Board of Governors of IIUM, and Yang Berhormat or Yang Berbahagia Emeritus Professor Tan Sri Datuk Zulkifli Abdul Razak, the Rector of IIUM, and former rectors who are present tonight, our distinguished speakers who are speakers at this three-day international conference, and distinguished ambassadors who are present here, and ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of ISTAC IIUM, I would like to welcome all of you to this very important event tonight, the opening forum of our international conference on international seminar on the contemporary Islamic thought and societal reforms. And the theme of this seminar is contemporary Islamic thought and prospects for societal reform, geocultural perspectives. We have a three-day international conference which began today, this afternoon, and we have 2 days more to go. But in conjunction with this seminar, we organized the opening community forum, which is tonight, and the closing forum on Friday afternoon. We would certainly invite you all to come to the Friday closing forum. With the title of the conference is World Economic Forum 2019, Muslim Responses. And tonight, the theme or the title of the forum is Islam and Multiculturalism. The subtitle is The Need for Educational Reform. I've been asked by some people, why do we have a panel featuring Anwar Ibrahim, and John Esposito? Is the seminar, the three seminar, organized in conjunction with the forum, or is it the other way around? Is the forum in conjunction with the seminar? Well, it's up to you how significant you want to attach to either one. But anyway, this is a significant forum. And of course, it's to us here at ISTAC, the combination of Datuk Sri Anwar Ibrahim and Professor John Esposito, tonight's forum is not something that is awkward, but in fact, very meaningful as for us, because the theme of our seminar is societal reform. Now, Datuk Sri Anwar Ibrahim, yes, he is a politician, and we use his letters, resignation, as member of parliament, of protection. And he's one of the reasons why he wants to contest as member of parliament. Why he wants to enter parliament is because he wants to initiate a very important reform. That is his promise. We believe him, and we'll find out tonight. And you can ask him what sort of reform that he wants to see, but the focus tonight is on educational reform. Now, as far as the issue of multiculturalism, well, this is a contested term. Again, I've been criticized, saying that, why multiculturalism? This is already an outdated issue. And clearly, it is opposed to Islam. As my reply is, no, multiculturalism is still a contested term. So if you contest the meanings given to that term, why can't Islam contest that? My point of view is that Islam has its own perspectives about multiculturalism. It is not a settled issue. In fact, as multiculturalism becomes a more important issue globally, we need to present the Islamic perspectives on multiculturalism. Even in Malaysia itself, I mean, we have to revisit. Basically, we have to revisit this issue. And hopefully tonight, the two speakers will highlight new issues pertaining to this. So basically, the question is how, or rather, how should we present ourselves from the perspective of Islam, this issue? But of course, we single out the issue of educational reform because that is the key to everything in a sense. Is our education system in line or not with the demands, with the demands and the, in a sense, the needs of multicultural societies? So I leave it to that. So thank you very much for the two speakers. We shall begin, but I want to say something about the organizer of this event. Actually, for this particular forum tonight, as distinct from the seminar itself, this event is organized, first of all, by ISTAC, IIUM, co-organized by Muslim, the Muslim Intellectual Forum, whose advisor is Datuk Sri Anwar Ibrahim, and by the Center for Islamic Economics, the Kuala of Economics and Management of IIUM. So the three organizations organized this event tonight. I attended, of course, this event organized by the Muslim Education Forum some time back ago. And we had at that time, it features our guest speaker, Dr. Sirajuddin who is the founding director of the Center for Post-Normal and Policy Studies. And in fact, Dr. Sirajuddin he is also a speaker in the 3-day forum. He will be giving his talk on Friday before noon on the subject of the future of Muslim reforms itself. It's a very, very interesting topic. So now I invite Datuk Sri Anwar Ibrahim to make his presentation. And then later we will have Professor John Esposito as someone as an outsider. Not so an outsider, but he's an outsider anyway, from the United States, who will respond to Datuk Sri Anwar Ibrahim's presentation, with all due respect.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Alhamdulillah nahmaduhu wa nusalli ala rasulihil karim. Saudara saya, Usman Bakar, Profesor John Esposito, dan Sri Zulkifli, duta-duta dan tetamu-tamu kehormat, saya menganggap ini satu penghormatan luar biasa kerana jemputan ini sebenarnya jemputan untuk mendengar kupasan dan hujahan intelektual, dan saya ini lebih dikenali sebagai petugas politik biasa. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's profound pleasure on my part to express my gratitude to Osman and the team in creating this new, or supporting this new found freedom to continue and exchange reasoned discourse on issues which some of us even consider very contentious. Now, this is of course relevant to our discourse tonight, because without creative thinking, without the essential freedom to articulate your views, we cannot hope to achieve a meaningful societal reform. I just got back from Doha, together with Davutoglu and Rashid Ghanousi, as speakers at a very, very important conference, 70 years of Marhum Malik bin Nabi. Now, Malik bin Nabi is not certainly a precursor, but a very profound figure that calls for societal reform, that expresses his utter disgust at the failure of Muslims to think freely and to interpret even the Quran in terms of its relevance to the society at present, during his time. He was very involved in the initial struggle against the French, but he felt more appalled at the rate and understanding of Islam by the community, by essentially Islamic communities. Now, in his phenomenon of Al-Quran, he talked about memorizing the Quran, which is of course encouraged, but not understanding its message and the call for Islah mastata', which is of course central to the Quranic message. In his Shurut al-Nahda, conditions for Renaissance, he of course talked about understanding, a creative and reasoned discourse, which must be a precondition, which is essentially a mastery, not only of the language, but of knowledge. And although he did not craft in the way that T.S. Eliot talks about information, knowledge, and wisdom, certainly in his Shurut al-Nahda, the conditions of Renaissance, he talks about the need for the Muslim society to engage and to have a profound understanding through knowledge and educational reform. Now, some of us assume that educational reform can be achieved through efforts by intellectuals and educationists. They may be right, but they have never been proven right throughout history. Salahuddin al-Ayyubi, for example, is known to be a fighter. Yes, a leader with such passion for justice and reform. But you must, some of you follow the life of Salahuddin, would realize that for the first 10 years after he took over, remember, not before he took over, the reform can be initiated by a clear, definitive policy. And he then used mosque to alert the Muslims about the predicament and malaise of the society by going back to the Quran, understanding Islam, but relating it to the plight of the modern man during his period. The malaise of the Ummah because of their failure to appreciate the need to master knowledge. So to my contention, therefore, as Osman alluded to earlier, is to support this effort by the present Pakatan Harapan government, for example. I have asked the Speaker in the House to support the setting up of a caucus on reform and governance in Parliament and hopefully the Senate that could oversee the need for societal reform. Because I don't believe that we can have effective educational reform without the commitment, the political will to do that. Now, I would summarize the exhortations by Malik bin Nabi when he talked about the need not only to acquire traditional Islamic knowledge, but modern disciplines, particularly during his period, psychology and sociology, because he's essentially a Khaldunian. He revised the interpretation of Ibn Khaldun in many ways, because to him, the interpretation of the Quran must be to understand the text and the context. Now, you are familiar, of course, I mean, this is essentially a gathering of intellectuals, a good grasp of our own history and historical antecedents. But you would realize, therefore, that being a bit nostalgic about the past is certainly no answer for the present. Understanding, yes, but we must also grapple with the problems of the present. Some of us are familiar with this Harry Miller's education without a soul. I tend to be a bit cynical to some of them, how Muslim scholars react to this book. I'm sure Tan Sri Zulkifli is more familiar because he's at the helm of the university. We talk about Harvard, and nobody could question the standard of excellence in academic discipline in Harvard. Since I was at Georgetown, I would say similar to Georgetown. But Miller's contention as a former dean was that the failure of the educational enterprise at Harvard is not in terms of its excellence in terms of academic disciplines, but have created or allowed the emergence of a new generation that is devoid of soul. It's a soulless society. They have university, they can articulate on all issues, but very little concern about the plight of the poor, the issue of discrimination against the blacks outside the campus. I heard a comment from some of intellectuals here who says that at least in our universities, they may include ISTAC and IIU, we may not achieve academic excellence, but we have a soul. I'm not too sure whether we achieved that level of understanding, appreciation, and grasping soul as envisaged both in Miller's book or certainly in Islamic tradition and aims of education. I think it is better that we begin with some humility. Humility to accept there are serious challenges affecting us in terms of academic disciplines, in terms of quality of education, and not the debate which to me seems to be quite irrelevant in our present discourse. Of course, we have linguistic skills. In Malaysia, we are quite determined to ensure that there must be adequate mastery of the national language. But it's not a zero-sum game. Languages, which include English or Arabic or French, must be open for students to master. The more languages, the more profound their level of understanding and education. But the debate here seems to be quite a zero-sum game. You master Malay, you must ignore English. You talk about competency in English, then you are seen, some of us may be in that category, to be ignoring the importance of the national language. But to me, more challenging is the whole issue of academic excellence, the quality of education, which is a major challenge in our society. We do hear reports. I remember in 1961, Professor Tuanku Aziz tends to be very cynical against experts, economic analysts, bankers, who tend to give somewhat very impressive reports and accounts of our achievements. You just need to travel 1 hour away from Kuala Lumpur to see grinding poverty or gross inequality with income, which oftentimes the experts in Kuala Lumpur, the economists, the analysts, which Rashid you are familiar with, seems to ignore. And I think this is, of course, a failure to grasp. And it's a similar case of education. We cannot compare ourselves with the poorest societies, countries in the Muslim world. We have to acknowledge the fact that we still have a long way to go to achieve academic excellence and to ensure that our students are being trained in terms of discipline, character, which have clear relevance to the contention of what a soul or a soulless society should not be, and a society with strong moral ethical values and principles. So my question is therefore, is not whether it is Islamic or Western, so much as to have a clear position on the need to excel and, of course, to attain the character and ethical moral values, which is clearly a principle that must be strongly embedded in Islamic ethics and religion. But this is, of course, for Syed to think about. I'm just giving provoking some issues here. I'm not, of course, naturally suggesting that we are essentially in a hopeless state, but I do question some of us who seem to think, I mean, the more Western educated political leaders or educationists would come and search for some report, some obscure findings to show how great we are, and on the other side, the so-called Islamists would say that, look, in our universities, particularly in this university, we have actually found the answer. I'm very involved, I'm very supportive. All these years, although for the last 20 years, I was not able to enter the university for reasons known to you, but my heart and soul is with the university. I'm still committed to the idea of education that must not only focus on educational excellence in terms of academic excellence, but also imbibe character, ethical, moral values and principles. My fear is this attitude that seems to be, to me, in a state of denial. If we truly understand the meaning of reform, the need to reform in this country, we should start by acknowledging that we are on such a low threshold. Then the challenge should be more meaningful. We can compare ourselves with the poorest countries in Africa, and we can gloat about it. But certainly, I think the challenge is to compare with the best. Academic excellence, of course, in the top universities. In terms of moral, ethical values, if we don't have them now, we look at the classical universities and institutions of the past. Now, I would end with a quote from Tocqueville. I hope it is not too contentious. It's like so-called more tolerant. After all, we are talking about multiculturalism. And though I did not, because I leave it to the more structured lecture by Esposito, not only a clique, but some of his books, including the encyclopedia, was clearly my compendium when I was in the solitary confinement in the prison cell. So I at least can safely say that there is also some blessing to be hauled and then thrown into the solitary confinement lockup, because it's an excellent time where you can read as much as you can, as you want. Some of my colleagues, including Professor Kamal and the rest, sent me books just now after dinner. I thought, oh, how wonderful it would have been if I could have received it last year. Then I would be able to really, I mean, it's amazing. You can spend 10 hours a day reading. Books happen to be just your friend. I mean, you meditate, you read the Quran, you memorize verses of the Quran, much more now than ever before. But I think devouring books was a real wonderful and great pleasure. Gives you so much solace, satisfaction, and contain your sanity and avoid madness in prison. But Tocqueville talks about general societal reform, looking at the early period in the United States history, about the problem of education and society, which must be addressed. This is different from an elitist discourse. The stark reality is there is grinding poverty in the Ummah and in this country. The stark reality is there's a gross inequality from those who are given the opportunity to get the best of education and facilities and those who have no means to get good education. So this whole rhetoric and slogan of UNESCO about democratization of access to quality education is still certainly very far from its target. Tocqueville said the danger of society, including education, when it can clearly allow or move to create two classes, one small, the other many, separating each other, separating from each other. Now, some of us look purely into statistical numbers, between the rich and the poor. But the stark reality is, when there is gross injustice, marginalization, neglect, then it will create within our societies one full of jealousy, defiance, and hate, and the other with their heads in the clouds. I'm cautioning you so that elites and intellectuals in this country, in our society and the Ummah, will not create those with heads in the clouds. This is more relevant here in this country because when we saw such a gigantic proportion of financial malfeasance, endemic corruption involving billions of dollars from public purse, you find political leaders damned scared, and you find elites and intellectuals all or mostly muted. This led to a complete destruction of institutions of governance, the judiciary, the enforcement agencies, corruption commission, and of course, political leadership. Let us learn from the lessons of history. And by this societal reform and economic reform, create a society that is not only knowledgeable and competent to address the problems of the present society, including artificial intelligence, digital revolution, but also to ensure that there is justice and fairness for all. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Thank you, Dr. Sri Anwar Ibrahim, for the presentation. I'm not going to make any comments. I just want to introduce you actually in his introduction, Professor John Esposito. Many of you know him very well, but just in case there's some of you here who are not familiar with him, let me read to you the latest update on his CV. For participants of the seminar, they already have that. But for those just attending the forum tonight, let me introduce him to you. John Esposito is a university professor of religion and international affairs and of Islamic studies at Georgetown University. He's also the founding director of the Al-Walid Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding in the Welsh School of Foreign Service. Previously, he was a Loyola Professor of Middle East Studies, College of the Holy Cross, past president of the American Academy of Region and Middle East Studies Associations of North America. Esposito has served as consultant to the U.S. Department of State and other agencies, European and Asian governments, corporations, universities, and media worldwide, and ambassador for the UN Alliance of Civilizations, and was a member of the World Economic Forum's Council of 100 Leaders. Professor Esposito has received honorary doctorate from many universities, including the University of Sarajevo and University of Florida. He received the American Academy of Religion's Martin Mati Award for the Public Understanding of Religion, Pakistan's Quaid Azam Award for Outstanding Contributions to Islamic Studies. He has written more than 50 books. He produced books faster rate than we can read them. So I don't know what is the latest book that we have here. Yes, and also his books and articles have been translated into more than 45 languages of the world. One achievement. So I think I have here the last book here, The Future of Islam, Islamophobia, and the Challenge of Pluralism in the 21st Century. Okay, please join.
Assalamu alaikum. I was sitting on the stage and getting a little depressed. I realized the first time I came here was 46 years ago, and I thought, I think I'm getting old. I want to apologize. Most of you, if you've ever seen me speak, I don't usually look at my notes. But because of the nature of what I'm talking about, and because this is 10 minutes after I usually go to bed, which is at 9 o'clock at night, I prefer to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning. I think I'll try to watch my notes. Dealing with the question tonight that I want to address is religion and multiculturalism in the public square. I can't emphasize too much the fact that I believe that the challenge in the 21st century is pluralism, religious pluralism and political pluralism. If you look around the world and you look at what's happening in the world and you don't see that the issue of multiculturalism and pluralism is important, then it means that you don't look at what's going on. Now, in Malaysia and Indonesia, you have far more diversity, and you have countries that have had a multicultural context, multi-ethnic, multi-religious context. But that's not the case in many parts of the Muslim world, and certainly not in many parts of the Middle East. But if you look at the realities in the West today, one sees a slide backwards. We are racing in the opposite direction of where we should go. In Europe and America, having developed and worked at developing reasonable democracies and pluralism, in fact, we're often going in the opposite direction. The rise of the far right, of white nationalism in Europe, and its impact on immigration and certainly on Muslims, its feeding of Islamophobia and anti-Semitism cannot be denied. All you have to do is look at the headlines every day. If you want to see the reality of this, go to bridge.georgetown.edu. It's a project that we created at Georgetown. Bridge.georgetown.edu. You will see material every day published on this issue. If you look at America, you look at American elections, the presidential elections that President Obama was involved in, when a significant number of his opposition, in fact, went after him with the accusation that he was a Muslim. And if you look at the man that led the accusation that, in fact, he wasn't really born in America, wasn't a citizen, and may have been a Muslim, and see that he's now President of the United States, you will realize we have a problem. When the President of a country says Islam hates us, I think it's probably a certain level of ignorance. I kept saying, well, he probably thinks there's a person named Islam, because he can't think that you can say Islam hates us. And when challenged in mass media, repeats that. And says things like, and there are so many of them. When one implements a Muslim ban, when one talks about Mexicans, Hispanics, etc., and basically is anti-immigrant, that same issue of being anti-immigrant we see also sweeping through Europe, that's a problem. Now, I remember years ago, the first time I came here, and I gave a series of lectures, and I didn't even have my doctorate. And the last lecture was on Islam in the West. So the first part of half of my lecture was a frontal critique of Western colonialism and its impact, etc. The audience loved it, obviously. Then I felt I had to talk about the other side of the coin, and then there was the ambivalence. You know, oh, I wonder what the influences there are. Probably because he's from the West, he's an Orientalist, etc. All my teachers were Muslim. My main teacher was Ismail al-Faruqi. But the reality of it is that we don't have a choice. It's not a matter of debating. And what's a little depressing is what occurred to me at the Islamic Society of North America's meeting. I was on a panel with a young, well, at my age, everybody that's under 80 is young. And after it, a man stopped me and said, a Muslim, I don't know from where, I really enjoyed your talk, but I was a little concerned. You know, you talked about pluralism. He said, and you know, my imam said that pluralism is polytheism, and it's haram. I said, excuse me? I thought maybe I couldn't understand his accent. He said, pluralism is polytheism. So I'm very conscious of where I'm going with this talk, and I want to bring that out. But the reality of it is, if you look at the Muslim world, I would say there's Islamophobia in Egypt. Muslim against Muslim. And I would say in many parts of the Gulf, where you have mainstream Islamic activists, not extremists and terrorists, and they have to worry about how the government is going to respond and the security forces, I would say that's discrimination, and I would say it's Islamophobia. But where we are today is influenced by recent years. I mean, what are some of the causes that feed a kind of anti-Islam, anti-Muslim attitude? Number one, the media. Now, it's not just a matter of bashing the media, it's dealing with the reality of the media. On the one hand, there's a phrase with media: if it bleeds, it leads. You put on the news, and if you want to grab an audience, I don't care where you go in the world, you lead off with these catastrophic situations. When I first moved and taught in Boston, and then when I went to Washington, my mother would come, put the TV on. The first thing she'd say to me the next morning is, "You can't stay here. Look at all the crime." On the other hand, my mother was from New York City. Many people don't want to go to New York because they think it's all crime. Well, a lot of it has to do with media coverage. So let me give you an example. I'm going to be very specific here in terms of what I'm talking about. There's a group called Media Tenor that looked at 975,000 pieces of Western media. 975,000 pieces of Western media. And it looked at it from 2001 to 2011. So it looked at all that media and said, where do we find Islam and Muslims? It found that 2% in 2001 of media stories in Western media presented images of Muslim militants and violence. 0.1% looked at what the vast majority of Muslims were like, or what was going on in, if you will, mainstream world. Jump to 2011, the 2% jumps to 25% negative, and the other side remains at 0.1%. That's a disparity, an important one. But jump to 2015, 2016, and it finds that another study that looked at Western media, 8 out of 10 stories were about extremists and terrorists. Even stories about mainstream Muslims, some of them were actually very provocative and contentious. When they focused on individuals, when they did, they tended to be terrorists or warlords. So you've got that impact. Now, how does this really get, real, as it were, traction in terms of moving forward? The fact is we've had major studies, for example, looking at the US in terms of support for these kind of anti-Muslim stories, anti-Muslim organizations. And studies have shown that close to $120 million has gone, a philanthropy of money has gone to these organizations. Okay? What do you see in terms of the Muslim world and Muslim societies responding to it, or in the US and in Europe? Not all that much. Often the community is very concerned about what's going on, but it doesn't look at what do we need to do to address that issue. With regard to the relationship of Islam to multiculturalism and to issues of pluralism, I can't believe that anybody, certainly anybody that's read the Quran, let alone studied Muslim history, does not have a sense of the way in which God in the Quran affirms the decision to create not just one single nation or tribe, but a world of different nations, ethnicities, tribes, and languages. O humankind, we have created you male and female, and made you nations and tribes, so that you might come to know one another. Didn't say to fight one another. The Quran's recognition of the human community's religious diversity, and we debate today, often in the West, is diversity a good thing rather than diversity can be a richness, not just a negative? But the Quran's recognition of the human community's religious diversity and support of religious pluralism can be found in the text, to everyone we have appointed a way and a course to follow. For each there is a direction toward which he turns. Vie therefore, compete therefore, with one another in the performance of good works. Wherever you may be, God shall bring you all together on the day of judgment. Surely God has power over all these things. I'll interrupt my citations from the Quran to tell you about a humorous thing that happened to me 20 years ago. I keynoted a conference of Muslims in America. And after it, a fellow from Jordan came up to me, put his arm on my shoulder and said, Brother John, mashallah, really enjoyed your talk. You're really doing such good work. He said, but and then he looked into my eyes and he said, you're not getting any younger. Like you'd better make the move now, because God knows when you're going to die, and it could be pretty soon. Anyway, that was probably 30 years ago. All right. Back to the Quran. Jews and Christians are seen as people of the book. It's a simple fact. There's more pluralism, from my point of view, or support for pluralism, for diversity, for the fact that God's creation was created that way, than one can find in many other religious texts. And of course, the phrase, there is no compulsion in Islam. Sometimes when I read stories and when I see things happening in some Muslim countries, I think, there's no compulsion in Islam? I'm not quite sure about that. The challenge of multiculturalism and religious pluralism is the challenge in the 21st century. It's not just a religious issue. It's also a political issue. It's a cultural issue. Because it impacts not only immigrants, but it impacts people who are just different and other. A robust religious pluralism is a prerequisite for life and for international relations. Look at where we are in the world today. I have to be careful, this is being recorded. I have to watch my language, it's too bad. When I first got out as an academic, and I remember talking to a friend of mine who was also on the National Security Council for President excuse me, to president years ago, I was sure in my lifetime, I thought, gosh, I really feel sorry for all of those poor, and you can fill the word in after that, people who've worked for peace in Palestine and are now retiring and feel like they haven't accomplished anything. They're like researchers spending your whole life trying to solve a disease, and at the end of it saying, I haven't made it. I knew in my lifetime that wouldn't be an issue. I was sure that things would move forward in terms of development in the Muslim world, and it has. But in many countries, it can be a step backwards. It's not just being underdeveloped is not just a question of poverty. It can be a question of the kind of resources and the style of life that's taking place. Just because you have wealth in a country doesn't mean that you're really all that developed. Just because you have brand new buildings that look great, it doesn't mean that in terms of your values, in terms of equity in the society, in terms of concern about poverty, concerned about repression, concerned about imprisonment, that you necessarily are doing well. We are all challenged today to move beyond the older established notion of tolerance. Tolerance today is an insulting word. If I say, I tolerate you, that means I let you live. That's what it meant historically. We can coexist didn't mean that we really coexist, talk to each other, wouldn't mind having you as a neighbor, etc. Tolerance meant that you aren't going to persecute the other. So we need to broaden that term. I think we need a new term, but we need to at least broaden that term so that we again realize that true tolerance means mutual respect, understanding, even when we don't agree, and supporting the civil liberties and the rights of all people, regardless of who they are. Regrettably, at times, a significant number of some of our religious leaders in Christianity, in Judaism, in Islam, and we see what's going on with regard to the Rohingya in Burma, really take positions that actually simply privilege one against the other and actually legitimate the marginalization and even persecution of the other. Don't even allow for that minimum of tolerance. The engagement in the public square of communities, religious, social, in neighborhoods, in towns, in education and schools, and common social issues is central to our moving forward. Interfaith dialogue is important, but it's a dialogue of life. It's not just that we get together and discuss some theology. It's what are you going to do with that? In what way are you going to implement it in society? It's educational reform, not just in the universities, but in the madrasas, the seminaries, the schools that train our religious leaders, because our religious leaders very often influence the nature of the next generation through their khutbahs, through their advice, through the positions that they take. It's outreach and training programs for high school teachers and college teachers and university teachers. We at Georgetown, in the center that I founded, we do a lot of that outreach, that training of teachers, because the teachers, again, impact that generation. It's interfaith youth groups. One of the best ways to move forward is interfaith youth groups. If you get to actually be with somebody and you're around them, you get to know them. I remember being in Singapore, and I asked a young diplomat how much influence, how much he interacted with Malays within Singapore. And he told me that the first time that happened was when, as a junior diplomat, they had to go away for a week together, all of the diplomats. And that was the first time he engaged someone who was Malay and who was Muslim. I remember being in a country that has a significant number of Muslim populations and having one of the senior leaders in the country, first question he wanted to ask me is, why would somebody want to become a Muslim? Now, as my father used to say to his three sons when we disagreed with him, you're too bright to be that stupid. And I wanted to say that to him, but we need to be concerned about what's going on in that world that we live in. We need to heed projects like Common Word. So let me ask you a question. I mean this seriously. Those of you who know what a common word between us and you is, okay, what that document is, would you raise your hands? Well, pretty depressing. I just saw about 10 hands go up. It's about 5 better than many audiences that I have. Here you have a major document done by 130 Muslim leaders around the world and then extended to another 300 or 400. Go on the internet and look up Common Word. A major document signed off by religious leaders who then reached out to major Christian leaders around the world, the Pope, the Archbishop of Canterbury, etc., that talks about the fact that we can have our differences, but we also have a global situation, which means that we have to work together and connected. We have religious roots for that cooperation, and that is love of God and love of neighbor. But how often, when we ask the question or answer it, who is the neighbor, do we really include some of the others? And even within religious communities at times, the more conservative versus the more progressive often talk about each other as if they weren't even in the same faith. I avoided a word that I actually like tonight, which is liberal, even better than progressive. The reason I avoided it is that I had a friend of mine tell me that somebody said to them, they asked a friend of theirs, are you going to come tonight? And he said, what, to listen to 2 liberals? I know he meant Osman and Anwar, and certainly not me. But so I'll just say progressives or reform-minded. So where are we in terms of moving forward? This is a very important sentence that I use. In public events in my family, if I have to speak, my wife speaks for me. I embody the emotional Italian. But it's the good news. Next time I come, any wedding or funeral you have, even if I don't know the person, you bring me there. As at my wedding, I cried, my wife didn't. Okay, people of all faiths and no faith, people of all faiths and no faith are challenged to embrace a pluralism based on mutual understanding and respect. Mutual understanding and respect doesn't mean that we agree about everything. It does mean that we take the time to learn about the other, that we understand and we respect their right to believe and do what they want as long as it doesn't affect or harm us, because we expect that in return. If we don't have that, and in many of our societies we don't, in many societies in the Muslim world, and in many societies, I've articulated it, in many parts of Europe and America. I was at a conference on Islamophobia in Europe 2 years ago, and a woman from Poland got up and said, the good news is we don't have many Muslims. The bad news is we have Islamophobia. You know, that it's very strong. Then I went to another conference, and a lawyer, Australian, said exactly the same thing. You know, let alone when you have leaders of government making the statements that they do. Look at the elections in Hungary, in Czechoslovakia, etc., let alone the situation in France. We need to seek to know and understand before we judge. We need to ensure that judgments which have implications both domestically and internationally are fair and informed. You see, if you're able to say that there is an Islamic exceptionalism, see? Now, of course, some people might say there is because I'm Muslim and yeah, we're exceptional. No, Islamic exceptionalism means that when we talk about civility, when we talk about development, when we talk in a lot of ways, it's as if Islam's a much different religion. One of the statements that I make is that I have the best of both worlds. I'm an academic, and I'm asked the same questions throughout 40 or 50 years of my work. The same exact questions by diplomats, by business people, by ordinary citizens. What's Islam like as a faith? Does it really, support the kind of violence that's out there? Is Islam this? Is Islam that? That's why I did the book, what everyone needs to know about Islam. and did a new book called What Everyone Needs to Know About Sharia. We need to display a self-criticism that recognizes, this is a very important point, that all religions, including our own, have a transcendent side, that we can agree on. A belief in a transcendent reality, we would say God. And the transcendent side is that if you follow God's way, you transcend your more base notions and attitudes and become a better person. But they all have a history that has a dark side. All religions have people who have appropriated and engaged in what I would call unholy wars, you see, and unholy crusades and unholy etc. All of them have a dark side where either emperors used it or religious leaders used religion to legitimate what they were going to do. And we see that certainly in recent years when we look at extremist groups across religions. I teach a course called Religion and Violence, Terror in the Name of God. We need to identify and promote the many shared beliefs, values, interests, without denying the differences and the uniqueness of our own religious traditions. In an age of globalization and increased religious and ethnic diversity, but also violence that often occurs and persecution, we need a religious pluralism and sense of multiculturalism founded on a deep understanding and respect, one that will truly meet the needs of the 21st century. Thank you.
Well, thank you, John. It's just past 9:30. We have another 1 hour according to our plan, so there's plenty of time for you to ask questions. So please tell us who you are. Please be precise, not too long, your questions, and then we can start now, okay? Please indicate to whom the question is being addressed, whether to one of them or to both. Please raise your hand. Okay, Professor Muhammad Harun from University of Botswana.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much for these presentations. When Dr. Seri Anwar was speaking about the comment pertaining to the generation without souls, many years ago there was a person who was in Tabligh Jama'ah, and he came to the university where I was, and he told the rector of the university, Mr. Rector, you know, at this university you've got all the faculties, faculty of engineering, faculty of science, but there's one faculty that you don't have, and that is the faculty of morality. So it somewhat underlines the fact that the notion of ethics seem to be absent within our institutions. And perhaps that is one of the dimensions of reform that has to be plugged back in or inserted as a way of transforming. So my question basically is, in terms of, to Dr. Seri Anwar, is to what extent, because I mean, like in Malaysia that we look forward to as outsiders, we say there are many Islamic universities, but how Islamic are they, if I may sort of add that sort of emphasis to that descriptive word? And because for us sometimes it is a problem to basically find, yes, it is Islamic university, but to what extent does it really produce Islamically minded individuals to serve the societies from wherever they come? So that is part of that question. And secondly is that when one talks about education reform, one asks a question, to what extent are those individuals involved in that reform themselves reformed? So in other words, there's a sort of double thing to this, in the sense that it's basically an egg and a chicken type of story. So I would like your basic comments on that. Thank you.
Professors ask difficult questions, not actually, shouldn't direct to politicians, should direct to the professors, and the rector is there. But I think your question is pertinent. We don't need Islamic labels. We need Islamic contents. We don't even need the so-called Islamic contents, but we need contents that is true to the spirit of the religion, which includes, of course, ethics and values, which should permeate in all disciplines. This is, of course, a contentious debate. Even when we started expanding the Islamic University, some faculties, there was always a huge debate on this. To what extent should you study Western philosophy and ideas, or should you just confine to Islamic legacy, Turath, and the classics? So this, I don't have strong views. You can have whatever, disciplines finally. But the important point is that in all disciplines, you must not repeat this mistake of what Ortega y Gasset said about barbarism or specialization, that disregard the importance of values and ethics. Now, how much do you expect, can you expect those so-called reformers are actually reformed? I agree with you. You know, I can be a politician, but I'm quite cynical against political leaders and the so-called elites. You study the history, historical antecedents of all revolutions. From the French Revolution, 10 years after the French Revolution, there was a grinding poverty among the farmers, far worse than the earlier period. I mean, you can't dispute the fact that the French Revolution had so much an appeal in terms of its ideas and the zealous aspirations of people in the struggle. You talk about the Bolsheviks, you talk about trees with destiny, Nehru's highly acclaimed inaugural speech after, during independence, or Jinnah's, or Pakistanis are aware, this speech at the National Assembly in 1947 about the cyclonic revolution, stressing on the issue of ethics and values. But look at Pakistan today. Hopefully Imran Khan can succeed in some ways. But most recently, of course, Mandela. You're more familiar. In one generation after Mandela, we produced Zuma. So there is therefore reason to suspect not necessarily the ideals presented by these leaders, but whether it could be sustained in the medium and long term. So these were all supporters of the reform. I initiated Reformasi in 1998. But I kept on reminding my friends that the spirit of reform means you yourself must initiate this Islah Maskata. Without that, it is just simple rhetoric. It would not mean anything, because the test is when, especially, is when you are in power. And this is, again, back to the central or fundamental subject, issue that we discussed tonight, is issue of knowledge and actualization of the ideals. And this is, of course, very, very Islamic, or in many ways religious, because this is not just an interplay of technical, intellectual debate, but having a strong passion for reform and justice as a form of belief. Now, on a note about what John said, which is very relevant about tolerance and knowing one another, respect. Because the Quranic term is lita'arafu. And lita'arafu is not tolerance. It's to have knowledge and understanding, which means respect. And still today, the moment you say respect Christianity or Buddhism or attending some Hindu functions, immediately you become a liberal and pluralistic. I mean, to me, just a clear disregard for what Islamic teaching is all about. You are not compromising on your belief system or your prayers or the fact that you believe that the ideal Islamic system. You do not concede on that. I mean, I am a firm believer. But in a society where you have Christians and Hindus and Buddhists, how do you then proceed without any attempt to understand them? We want them to understand us, but we don't need to understand them. How many Muslim countries have centers that study other religions and other things? I mean, don't talk about Al-Biruni, which he specializes in Hinduism. I'm talking about a basic understanding. You must. If you want them, I want every Malaysian, Hindu, Buddhist, Christians, enemies, to understand and appreciate Islam, because Islam is the religion of the Federation and many of our institutions are Islamic. But I must also show enough compassion to understand them and talk about why the Hindus celebrate Deepavali. And I don't think it is necessarily disrespect to my faith in trying to understand them. I mean, this is, I think, the basic failure which John has addressed, is issue li ta'arafu. We use the term li ta'arafu. We say it is not just tolerance but understanding, but we will reject and strongly oppose any attempt to understand the other. I'm not disputing the fact there is Islamophobia, that there is. It's not only today, it's not, don't be too overly surprised. The entire approach towards even academic subjects, those of us who study anthropology or economics in the university, the entire approach is so Western, so anti what we stand for. I concede. But we cannot move, we cannot run this country in particular, Malaysia, which is plural, which is multiracial, without any semblance of respect and understanding of other religions.
Okay, I saw just now here is yes, 1, 2, 3.
Assalamualaikum.
Now this one, yes, please.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. First, let me introduce a little bit about myself. My name is Ahmad Sharif. I'm Indonesian citizen, working in Singapore, but spend my weekend on Kuala Lumpur every weekend. I'm also 27 years old, which means I'm part of millennial generation, people call. And also, I'm working as software engineering, which value so much critical thinking and logical analysis. I think it's important to describe a little bit so that my question is a little bit relevant to that. From my point of view, as part of especially new generations, there's there's a tendency I think in Muslim society to somehow directly reject any sort of like policy that even just touch the skin of the Muslim culture or Muslim society habit. Just now, Dato' Sri Anwar talking about that the important part of the societal reform is actually policy reform itself. But how can the policy be reformed if any policy suddenly be rejected without any further discussions? This question is for Dato' Sri Anwar. What do you think about that from your point of view as policymaker? The second question is, this is just from my observations, there's a tendency also in the Muslim society that we just only want to talk about our own problem. We never really talk about shared human problem. Let's say just now Dato' mentioned about artificial intelligence, climate science. There's no, maybe I don't read more or I don't go to the seminar more, but that's the feeling that I have as a part of this generation. Seems like we just mind our own business. We don't care about humanity humanity problem as a whole. Even though we are saying that we are the Khalifa of this world. That's two questions for Dato' Sri Ibrahim. What do you think about that? And I have another question for Professor Alposito. So just now you mentioned that there's Islamophobia in Western society. Yes, it's true, but I think also there's also probably kind of like Jewishophobia or Christianophobia in my own society. At least from my own experience, when I was a child, every time I heard the word Jewish or Christian itself, it always followed by a bad word. Like, okay, every bad situation in this world is a plot of Jewish to make the Muslim, I don't know, to make disaster toward the Muslim. And that's why I heard during my childhood. I think now that I'm working in an international company, I met many people. I know, like, for example, I heard that the French is very lazy, for example. There's a common stereotype to them. But every time when I work with them, I know that they're actually very diligent and very dedicated to their work. You also talk about the media. So my question is actually for you is about the media. So you say that, okay, the problem is media, but what can we do with the media itself? Because the reality is people are ignorant. I mean, we don't care what happened outside of our own community. Like, I don't care what the Jewish think because I never really live with the Jewish. All the information about the Jewish or Christianity or other community I get from the media. So do we need to change how the business of the media works, or do we need a policy or basically anything concrete that can solve this problem? Because seems like the media is just driven by the business itself, no real changes so far. Okay, that's all my question. Thank you.
Terima kasih. You see, the resistance to new ideas is not necessarily a problem with the masses. Sociological studies have shown that even elites who have imbibed certain sets of doctrines have difficulty or unwillingness either to protect their turf, their interests, would resent and resist new ideas. We experience them now here. I mean, I'm not assuming that political leadership are all aware and committed to the reform, but certainly the resistance is real. But it is a challenge, which means we have to take adequate measures to explain, have the patience, disseminate information. After all, if you look at the historical anti-Semitism,
because often that can also sell. But I think media in some areas have become more sensitive because citizens do respond. You know, years ago, Fatih Osman, many of you won't know the name, but a really great Muslim intellectual scholar, just a great person. He and I spoke at MIT, and during the Q&A, some kid from MIT gets up and says, you know, you need to be doing even more of this. You know, so I said, and what are you doing? Oh, well, I'm a student, and you know, I have to study. I have to get my work done. But you need to be doing more of this. And a lot of people take that approach towards life. You know, I have this phrase, somebody actually reminded me of it. They looked at a YouTube. I gave a talk and I talked about, no, I won't get into that one. But let me give you an example of something concrete and something to learn from. And by the way, there is discrimination against Christians and against Jews. We do have anti-Semitism, and we have also people with anti-Christian attitudes, okay? But look at the Muslim ban. The day that the president's Muslim ban was put into action, what happened within hours? It stunned people, not only in America, but people who saw it on the media. Americans from different walks of life went to the airports. Lawyers, regardless of whether they were Muslim, Christian, Jew, or, you know, a non-religious believer, but were concerned about human rights, etc., were at the airport giving free counseling to people. People from NGOs that normally just worked with, let's say, their particular area, you know, like an issue of race or an issue of poverty, suddenly realized we share this world in common. And one of the positive fallouts from that is that there's much more of a feeling that the only way that we can become powerful is to work together, and so NGOs work together. And what do you see with some of the Muslim organizations in recent years? They, in fact, when it comes to Islamic relief, they don't just bring relief to Muslims, they bring relief to whomever is having a problem, and they can work on it. A friend of mine who was one of the top people at the time with ICNA, which is a Muslim organization, and often in areas like Texas, you know, immediately, if you looked at the media, what people would think, but ICNA came up with an idea of when we have this Go Back to School Week. And so Go Back to School Week, they provided materials for students, for any student. Suddenly they got positive media about their project, and nobody got into, oh, wait a minute, you're a Muslim, what does that mean? You know, is your family extremist, etc. I think that that's really the direction that we need to go. And I think that, you know, one can say that, you know, leave it to the younger generation, but that doesn't work. I think it's something that everybody has to get into. I'm positive in the sense of this. If you're in some certain countries, such as America, okay, you have to be extraordinarily wealthy, and also it's difficult to find a school that is completely what you want, and in effect is racist. I.e., we are such a multi-ethnic and multicultural society that when you go to public school, you're interacting with people from all over the world, whether your parents like it or not. If they want you to go to this school, that's where you go. And even when you go to private schools, you know, the posh private schools in the old days that were only for white Anglo-Saxon Protestants are very integrated. In fact, one study came out and said that, in fact, if you actually had open admissions, in many of these private academies would be dominated by people from Asia, Asian kids who have, you know, good discipline and work. So, you know, we have that ability to, I think, to move forward. But it's also important for the older generation to be involved, because the older generation has an ability within society to have influence in different areas. And one of the things that we do fall into is what I call, I'll get back to that YouTube, the Muslim couch potato. The Muslim couch potato is that when you have a fundraiser, you see, it's like when people watch sports, the Super Bowl, and they wear sports outfits, but they don't actually engage in sports. You know, or I'm a runner. I will go to Pakistan in some places, and I'll be out running, and I'll see these young kids. They got the latest outfit, and I can just spin around them. I do my 6 miles, and they do a quarter of a mile, and then they talk about it. Well, the Muslim couch potato is when you do a fundraiser, and I've done a lot of Muslim fundraisers. And you have people, we come together, and we talk about Palestine. We sweat about Palestine. We cry about Palestine. We denounce American foreign policy. We denounce colonialism. We denounce neo-colonialism. And then everybody goes home, and they feel good. Because they said the right thing, and because they could also say to themselves, unlike even people that I know, you know, my neighbor and my faith, I actually go out at night to talk about it. But when you actually look at how much money do they give to the fundraiser, you know, you don't see that. A very, very wealthy person from a major Muslim country had a wedding that I went to. Okay. What was the most important thing for this person? He flew in musicians from his home country. Members of the government came because this person was very wealthy and successful. None of them were at the head table. At the head table, this is back a few years, you had Clintons, the Gores, some of the leading Republicans, all at the head table, you see? And that's also a photo op Muslim. Don't take a chance. You might lose a photo op or an opportunity commercially, so don't speak out on issues. You know? And I think that that's a challenge that we have across our societies.
Okay, no, I promise the yes, please. Please try to be
Brief.
to the point so that we have more questions.
All right, I try. Assalamualaikum, Datuk Sri and John. My question is, basically, when you say that you read a lot of books in the jail, in the prison, right? We outside, we watch and rewatch your videos, and we read and reread your books, Asian Renaissance, many times, just to understand what's going on outside. And I cannot only talk on behalf of myself, I cannot talk on behalf of others, but that is what I observe in my own circle. The question is, why are we still here? Why are we here in ISTAC? Why are we not in Angkasa Puri? Why are these kind of crucial discourse, intellectual discourse, still happening underground, even though despite we've won in the previous election? Why are we still need to go quiet? And how many times Anwar Ibrahim appear on RTM? I saw Esro Awani on one of the ads. Esro Awani is Esro. People have to pay for it. And you talk about YouTube. How can you compete with YouTube content if you have like Lady Gaga, Rihanna, right? All these videos that pop up, you know, how much you have views in YouTube. You know, despite all the other things that bombard the discourse. And I still remember in one of the talk Mr. Anwar, and with Fukuyama in Stanford, before you were in jail, you said that the importance of us leading the narrative, the mainstream narrative. Our Malay and Muslim people really need the theological arguments as well as sociological arguments to fight this misunderstanding. I think this is a very pressing need for our Muslim communities. We are now, they have Islamic phobia, we have liberal phobia, we have pluralism phobia. We among ourselves afraid of the liberal word that in our preamble before we talk about Rukun Negara. We ourselves afraid of the word liberal with some misinterpretation of our previous leaders with that anti-intellectualism movement, Project Pembodohan, Berbalism dan sebagainya. For many years.
Can you finally, what's your question?
The question is, how serious when you are a prime minister of this country, and I hope you will be.
Okay.
How serious the government currently and also in the future to address this issue, to reverse back this anti-intellectualism that has been happening to Malay Muslim like me in the urban area as well as in the remote area.
Okay.
That is my concern.
How to reverse the anti-intellectualism? Yeah? Right.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you. Now, you must concede that under this new administration, under Dr. Mahathir, there is a semblance of freedom. Universities would invite speakers from different ideological backgrounds or parties, which was not the case before. As I said, although it's held at ISTAC, this is the first time I'm able to come to an institution that I helped build. You know, I mean, I was virtually working with Naqib Al-Atas, Professor Naqib, had this. Otherwise, you know, and I happened to be Minister of Finance at the time when there was a surplus in our budget. So you can have this sort of beautiful ambience, which you can't have at present. But, of course, alhamdulillah, there is that semblance of freedom. In fact, we can organize any forum anywhere. I understand some limitations probably in the government media, which I will of course speak to Minister Gobind Singh to allow for more intellectual discourse. Probably, yeah. if it's too much, you don't have many viewers. You must also understand that's why universities become the focal point, because it is here that you can generate interest in the realm of ideas, not necessarily in the public domain yet. But I agree with you. The discourse can be very mediocre, and people just reject. Pluralistic tak boleh. Boleh. I mean, there is a point. I understand. If liberalism means, in the context of an anti-religious secular framework, I understand. You know, but they can't just totally generalize and reject any sort of liberal ideas, particularly because those who reject liberalism and pluralism are those who represent the neo-conservative outlook, the wala to the ustaz or the sheikh without thinking. And you know, the society will be punished, will be condemned to intellectual poverty, because you just completely subscribe to a viewpoint of a particular leader or sheikh, because probably his governments, and you don't allow for any discourse. This is not an issue peculiar to Malay society, but internationally, among Muslim societies. You do not have discourse. One area you have oppressive dictators, authoritarian regimes. On the other hand, even when you have freedom, like we have here now, we still have the sheikh who dictate issues that you cannot discuss, and you must subscribe yourself to support in the term wala, which I think is a concoction. I mean, it's like probably less, a more crude language would be like a prostitution of the language. This is used by Sukarno, by the way, it's not mine. It's like prostituting. You sell your soul in the name of religion. So I hope you the young generation, I'm very optimistic, will have that courage of conviction, the tenacity of purpose to continue and engage. Now, with that forum with Fukuyama and Larry Diamond at Stanford University, some years ago, you see, before I entered prison, I entered prison so many times that you have to mention the year. But I think this was about 2012, I suppose. I said, we should not allow Washington or London or Paris to dictate the language of discourse. We have our own narrative. Okay? We can challenge Islamophobia, but we have also to acknowledge the fact that there is major malaise, sickness in Muslim societies themselves. The unwillingness to be creative, to allow for free flow of thought and ideas, to engage in a reasoned discourse. That is essentially our problem. The mushrooming of this neo-conservative outlook. Yes, we have problems with the secular, the anti-Islamic views, even in our society. The intolerance of anything Islam. I have a problem myself. Although I claim to represent some Islamic ideals, you can watch during the elections, by-elections, parliamentary by-elections, politics. Some of the extreme secular liberals were up in arms, fighting against me. To use a crude language again, I couldn't care a damn. Because we must set the narrative. Not anti-Islam, but to have Muslims resolve the problem, the inner sickness within Muslim society. It is the dynamics within Muslim society that we have to address. That's why I say we must start and initiate the narrative, not to only respond to the dictates of the rest. The Americans can think they can influence and conquer half the world. No longer so if we have the courage. This is precisely what Malik bin Nabi al-Marhum said about colonoscibility. It's not just colonization, but the propensity, attitude of those colonized to just accept without any preparedness to to think and evaluate and assess. So I think coloniality was relevant in the 30s and 40s, whilst working against the French or the colonial masters, but it is equally relevant now because there's too many of us, the so-called liberals. You know, I had a big fight with the so-called liberals recently because of this. I mean, they want us to agree with them. They call themselves liberal, but we can't say anything. Anything Malay, anything Islamic means you are illiberal. So I also take an issue with them. But at the same time, I have a problem with the other neoconservatives. You can easily thinking, no, you must be a big sheikh to talk about Islam. If you are not a sheikh with a big robe, then you don't have the credibility to articulate Islamic views, Islamic vision. So we have to deal with it. Mind you, I tell you, you have the confidence, the conviction, we will, inshallah, win in this battle.
I would just make a very brief statement, and that is that, you know, people often make a judgment about an individual or a party during a heated election period and what they really, you know, do they really stand for, etc. I mean, I deliberately, in this talk and as well as my talk tomorrow on Islamic reform, I deliberately do not refer to Anwar Ibrahim, other than in passing. Because the reality from my point of view is that people ought to realize that it's not just that Anwar Ibrahim talks the way he does now. The reason why John Vole and I, when we did a book called Makers of Contemporary Islam, included a chapter, was that even then, years ago, you know, take three things that he talked about in those years. Convivencia, referring to Andalusia and how Muslims, Jews, and Christians live together. Reformasi. These are the kinds of positions, just as with Asian values, emphasizing, you know, what people share in common, you know, within an area. These are positions that were taken then. So it tells you who that person is. Whereas when you're dealing with any candidate, you should look at not what they say right during the election time, but what has their life been like? What have they said? We run into that problem in the US too, especially if you look at the outcome of some of our recent elections. You know, who is this person? You don't get the person in terms of what they're saying right now. You know, before the camera, to the face, when they're running. You take a look and say, what were the kinds of things that they stood for before? Is there a thread here that connects positively or negatively? I think that's a really important fact. Otherwise, in the heat of a politicized situation, or in the heat of who's got the most money, you know, we lose fact of, you know, we lose sight of what's actually the important thing.
Okay, I saw first, okay, Brother Razi, on the condition that you make sure your question is short one. Your remarks.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. And this could be a naive question, but I would like this to address both Dr. Suri and Professor. What is, since we are talking about reform and ideals, what is your reference? As in, is there any country at present which could be a reference which we could aspire to? If not, what is the most recent, as we go down back to history, what is the most recent example of an ideal Muslim country that we could aspire to, and why? That's my question. Assalamualaikum.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that.
We of course strive for the ideal. Now I believe in a society that's democratic precisely because it allows for discourse. So I always mention Turkey as number one. Number two is Indonesia. Now, of course there are limitations, people criticize. There was a coup d'etat, I mean a very serious attempt. 300 lives were killed, including my very close friend, Errol, and his 16-year-old son. And naturally, Tayyip Erdogan reacted by arresting all those involved, and including the Gulen operators. Now you may partly disagree with the extent of his measures. But you cannot discount the fact that he has been admired because there's one courageous leader who can stand up against anybody in defense of the rights of people of Turkey and also the Ummah, or Rohingyas, the Palestinians. So I think there's certainly a lot to learn. But there are things that people don't know. I don't claim to be knowing him very well, but of course he's a close brother. You know, leaders, they articulate their views, a lot of rhetoric. Many of them don't even mean what they say. We will fight corruption, and they are the greatest of corruptors. Okay? We will, you know, economy is not good. Learn to live simply, and they squander half of the wealth of the country. So I think people have a right to be cynical against political leaders. I was invited immediately after Tayyip recuperated from a major sickness. I was telling him it was because very emotional encounter between us. You know, his remark was startling. I was asking about, you know, what happened. He said, yeah, I had the best hospitals, the best facilities, and I was given exclusive, very good treatment. Alhamdulillah. But I happened to be, at that time, Prime Minister or President. So I start thinking, Anwar, what do I do with my masses? People in Anatolia and the suburbs of Istanbul or Ankara, what do they get? Can they get somewhat similar or even at least good facility? I mean, here comes the Prime Minister who told me to meet his Finance Minister at that time, Syed, Syed, is it? Yeah. He said, discuss with him because I want your advice, your views. How do we build as many hospitals throughout the country? Because I want my people to get facilities as good as I get. Can you imagine that? You see, this is the strength. That's why I tend to be, people say I'm biased, but I don't find that many leaders I've met. Everybody talks about themselves, how nice and the opulence, etc. But here comes a person who said, look, I have to do it. So the following day when I met the finance minister, he was just, oh my God, the president is just, you know, insisting I be so many, how do we find the money and the billions. So there was an exchange. And now you find that facilities. And of course I benefited because when I had my surgery done, the back and also the titanium shoulder replacement, I used to tell my friends, I get the best hospital, the best specialists, the best facilities, and the prettiest nurses. That's why Aziza was a bit concerned about that. So and that is the reason why I want Turkey to be looked at. Not necessarily we should be supporting every single measure or move, but you see the important ingredients in what a governance is all about. Education. You find in the last 10 years, and now the number of universities, research institutions being set up is phenomenal. I think it's only, I don't know, not comparable to any country right now, any Muslim country. So I would then suggest that we look at what they are doing. We defer in some issues. I mean, every time I meet him, some hours we continue to argue about some of the issues, political issues or detention, etc. But I certainly say that we can. But is that an ideal situation? No, because I think in an ideal situation, we should look at the positive points, incidents in history, from the experiences of the great caliphs, the Sahaba, how things are being run. Including, for example, we were talking the other day on the caucus on reform and governance in Parliament. I chaired that caucus, Lim Kit Siang was deputy, and we were talking about prison reform in general. I said, Mark Twain, if I'm not mistaken, once said that you can understand and appreciate the state of civilization of a country by looking at their prison conditions. And I know for a fact what the prison condition is all about. Now, but before that, Sayyidina Ali bin Abi Talib, for example, made his preoccupation. One of the things he has to do is to go and visit prisons. I mean, this is what governance is all about. So, naturally, a lot needs to be done. I mean, our brother just now said about the media. The media has got to be free and generate intensive, serious discussions and not just infotainment, which is part, but we can't. In my days, it was Dickie Nelson, Elvis Presley, P. Ramlee. So, and then afterwards, Beatles. And you would, I don't know, see, you know, Haliza or Khaybaha or whoever, I don't know. Yeah, because I think some of the names may be ancient. You don't ask Osman, he does not know anything about these pop singers. I have to, because I have to engage with the young, not necessarily at the universities. So I think that is, to me, essential. I don't think we should be too preoccupied, except to learn. Why can't you learn? There's certain things you can learn from China. There's certain things you can learn from Turkey or India. Even the West. You know, you don't be so anti-America that you refuse to learn from them. There will be disaster for our country. But we learn, what do we learn from America? Among the young. We learn Michael Jackson. Some of our youth know more about Michael Jackson than digital revolution or artificial intelligence. The problem is us, not necessarily them. That's why I think if you want to initiate change or reform, we must be prepared to have the humility. I used to quote this, and John has heard this before, from T.S. Eliot, who said the only wisdom one can hope to acquire is humility. Humility is endless. Because you have humility, then you realize to govern means to learn and implement. What do I do in the last many months? I don't hold any position. I've told Tun Mahathir, I'm not, please, allow me to be free to travel and learn. So I've said to him, no, I'm not going to hold any governmental position. That caucus is a position in parliament. It's not a governmental position with no allowance. Now, what do? I listen to all these consultants, ridicule them at times, professors coming in, giving their views, and I just take note, listen, and give my views. At the right time, when I think I'm ready, then hopefully I can implement. Although Tan Sri Zul has not come to see me, we're still busy taking over. But then, of course, this is in the plan, in the program. People come and give you. And that's the best. Then you go to Turkey. You learn from them. You go to Indonesia. You learn from them. I was in India. I spent the whole day in Bangalore learning about digital economy in Bangalore. I was in Qatar. Imagine, Qatar used to import everything, agricultural products. Then they had this blockade. Turkish government, Tayyip Erdogan, helped them initially. Now, they are able to export milk, fresh milk. Can you imagine? It takes not only courage, but clear policy, direction from the leadership. We, for Islamic agriculture, we import virtually everything because there's no blockade. But don't wait for a blockade to try and undertake some serious reform measures.
I'll let that be the last word. I have been a great admirer of a number of countries, including my own. But at this juncture, I feel very strongly about what America stands for. That is, in theory, self-determination, human rights, civil liberties, and I don't see that playing out. I when I look at when I look at where we are today, and many, I began at the beginning of my talk about it. When I look at today at countries in Europe, my own country, and I look at many countries in the Muslim world, some of the countries have become more authoritarian. The reaction to the Arab Spring has meant that many authoritarian, for example, leaders in the Gulf have really become more entrenched, and their policies, including at times the relationship of some Western countries with them, is an issue. I have been, in my writing, I have admired some of the leaders in the Muslim world, like Erdogan, like Ghanouchi, but when it comes to completely, to be frank and to be blunt, when it comes to completely understanding at times some elements of what's going on in Turkey, I'm concerned about that at times. But I have to say, the track record for many years was just remarkable in every way. I'm not just talking about economic growth and the sense of leadership. But I think that we're at a juncture where the real question is, where are we going to be in a number of years from now? And I certainly think that when we look at governments, our own governments, etc., and we don't realize that we really need to move forward in terms of reform, I think then we have a problem. I think there are more and more people who are concerned about what's going on in their country, but there are an awful lot of people who aren't. I remember speaking at an iftar at the University of Chicago, and it was a packed iftar. At the end of it, I basically said to the audience, when you're a speaker, you know whether or not you're holding the audience's attention. And I knew we were on a rise. We were really feeling good. That was the night when I knew that there were some people who go after me, I won't mention their names, but who are Islamophobes. And at one point in the course of my speech, I was trying to move the audience, and I said, we need to work together. This is our great, and I stopped and said, oh, what the hell, I'll say it, our great jihad. And then I said, watch tomorrow and look at the internet and see what's out there. The reality of it is, I think that we need to be aware, as I said at the University of Chicago, that it's not other people who need to get the job done. We need to do that. I think if anybody in today's world, if anybody doesn't realize that they have a vested interest in what's going on in their country and internationally, it's not just a question of human rights. It's a question of the economy. It's a question of the fallout from globalization, not just the positive side of globalization. I think all of those things are there. But I'm a little less sure on some issues than I was before, if I have to be honest about it. I think that the report of Freedom House, an organization that often I've been critical of, but in the last few years it seems to really be getting it right. And the fact that 10 years ago one could say that there was an increase in democratization and that now it had fallen off considerably. And the fact that they actually gave it as an example of the problem, cited the President of the United States. I don't remember that ever happening before. And just basically said in passing, anybody, if you've got somebody who praises the leader of China, who's basically arranged it so he can be a leader for life, who praises the leader of the Philippines, okay, that says something we have to think about, just as I think the post-Arab Spring situation, what's gone on in Egypt, the policies of some of the Gulf states, a number of which I used to love to go to and look forward to a future. But I think one of the things one has to think about when you look at some countries is, okay, it's terrific that women can drive, but how about the women's leaders who then have been arrested and held in prison? Okay, it's great to give greater freedom to your population, but how about political freedom? And I think that that's the situation. And again, I want to come back and say, we have these issues in my own country. So it's not me, just as we're criticizing the other. We have to be very concerned about the way in which our justice system has, at times, under a number of administrations, not just the current administration, and not just the Bush administration, even in the Obama administration, the way in which justice departments dealt with justice. Anyway, that was a negative thing. But anyway, let's think something positive. Like, we can go to bed pretty soon.
This is the end. This is supposed to be the last question. Let me end by just thanking John. John Esposito, many of you may not be familiar with. He's one of the few scholars, Christian scholars, they're so supportive and in defense of Islam in the United States. You cannot imagine, because we think America as one homogeneous entity. No, he does not represent the Trump administration. And because of what he wrote and defended years, we have personalities like Daniel Pipes, University Watch, putting him in the same category as the pro-terrorists or the Taliban. So a person like him in the United States have taken enough risk in defending what he considers as right. So I think it is important for us in evaluating United States of America. Okay, we can resent Trump policies, but they are not one. I used to teach at Georgetown University. I'm going there again next week. And this is a university that shows so much, not only tolerance, but understanding of the others. I mean, you can get around among the academic staff and students, very comfortable, say whatever you like, a strong pro-Palestinian lobby there, and they survive, unlike some other universities. And we talk about Islam or some of the other issues, which is considered somewhat contentious in many universities. And that happens to be a Jesuit Catholic university, mind you. And people sometimes don't appreciate this. So people see me and defend, they say, look, Anwar's again pro-United States. I am against most of foreign policy decisions of the United States. But I have to take cognizance of the fact that there are real brothers who believe in freedom, who care for us. Even me, in my personal case, from the president of the university to the professors, the way they campaign and work so hard to defend because of freedom. So I think we need to know the risk he's taking, the warnings he has received from those close to the righties Republican establishment, or the Daniel Pipes and the likes. So that is why I think we in Malaysia is indebted to him. But thank you, Osman, who has taken this initiative. And to me personally, something great that you find ISTAC being revived and becomes a center for this sort of a discourse. And in Tansi Zulkifli, the new rector, who believes very strongly in enhancing the academic standards of the university. We had one of the few vice chancellors whom, in a previous administration, whom I admire. I'm very selective in my assessment. So I wish both Osman and Zul well, and I think this is the beginning of many, many sort of discourse to come. Terima kasih. Wassalamualaikum.
I promised Datuk Sri Anwar that there will be the last. But now I have to exercise my authority as the moderator, because there's one request from Her Excellency Dr. Marve Kauchi. We have not got any question from a lady, number one. Number two, she is Turkish, whose president you admire. Number three, she is a diplomat. But it's the last.
Okay, that's the last one. Number four, I'm very delighted to be here. IIUM-ISTAC is phenomenal. I'm a product of the sort of thinkers and the visionaries on the other side of the world in Washington, D.C. who have also been part of this endeavor, who have reported to us at International Islamic Institute of Thought. And more importantly, this very institution has been receiving the Turkish students, professors who have been prosecuted, persecuted, and the like over the decades because they were thought as secondary citizens and even stripped of their citizenship rights, such as teaching and getting education. This very university welcomed them with open arms. But most importantly, these two great guys up there have been my neighbors at Georgetown University. I was at George Washington University. I was very honored to have a discourse with both of them and actually teach the books of Professor Esposito. With Dr. Sri Anwar, of course, we were both in political exile in the other part of the world while he was at Georgetown and I was at George Washington University. Thank you very much for your comments. One of the first things that I will learn, I think, next week when we meet up with Dr. Zulkifli, Professor Rector Zulkifli, is for me to learn what liberalism means within the Malaysian context. I look forward to that. But I must say a few things just to set the record straight about my own country and the coup attempt that we had endured on July 15, 2016. A so-called religious group that we thought was doing religious work has joined hands with the secular fundamentalists within the military to bomb and kill civilians with F-16s. As you had put it rightly, 251 of them, civilians in different parts of the world, they killed. Around 3,000 they have wounded. They have smashed with a tank a mother and a child, point blank. They became like a piece of paper. They bombed people in a way that a police officer of the presidential palace, her head was blown to the rooftop. These are our own people that we fostered. We thought they are our Muslim brothers and sisters who disguised themselves over almost 40 years of time period, who had the legitimacy of disguising and concealing their identity in a way under the pressure of the secular fundamentalist tradition of the Republic of Turkey from the get-go, from 1920s. So nobody thought that they would actually murder innocent people. And they bombed the parliament. They also attacked the Bosphorus Bridge and wanted to assassinate our president, prime minister, and our leaders. These are our ISIS, period. if Daesh, if someone could say that Daesh is okay, it's freedom of expression, it's okay to go and accommodate them, it is the same to say that Fethullah Gulen terrorist organization is okay. Just wanted to put that into record. Thank you very much for your understanding. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Thank you very much. Before I pass this microphone to the MC, I just want to say that, well, first of all, the forum tonight is a very fruitful one. There are many things, very important things that we learn or that we want to hear from both of them. I just want to say two things. One from Datuk Sri Anwar and the other from Professor Esposito. From Datuk Sri Anwar is his commitment, his promise of a new era of academic and intellectual freedom. Because for us in universities and institutions of higher learning, there's nothing more precious than having this intellectual and academic freedom. And of course, it is nice to hear his caucus, not non-governmental, but doing good work. So while he talks happily about progress in prison reform, we want to hear progress in university reform. Who knows, perhaps, with more university reform than at the same time doing a service to prison reform. The other one is to John, who emphasized that one of the most important issues in the 21st century is the issue of pluralism or multiculturalism. I share that view, and certainly this institute would try its best to contribute, if not to the solution, to the discourse on the subject. To see how difficult it is to deal with pluralism, I think maybe IISTAC, this institute, can start first, not with Malaysian pluralism, but with Pakatan pluralism. Yes, I'm not joking. Inshallah, we'll pursue the program in such a way that we want to know, not only from Datuk Sri Anwar Ibrahim, but from the four component parties, the Pakatan Harapan, what is their views about societal reforms in Malaysia, inshallah. So please join me in thanking both of them for the good forum tonight. And please, I would invite you, please, if possible, please come on Friday at 3 o'clock. It's going to be a forum at the title, World Economic Forum 2019, Muslim Responses. I take this from Datuk Sri, from Tan Sri Zul, because he said, we have to present. We have not yet presented our Muslim responses to the World Economic Forum. I think we're going to have a good panel, including he himself will be a panel for that forum. So I pass back now to our MC.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Usman, for moderating this session. We would like to record our appreciation to our distinguished speakers, Datuk Sri Anwar and also Professor John Esposito, for the thought-provoking discussions. We hope that we will have more discourses like this in the future, inshallah. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is customary for us at the International Islamic University, Malaysia, to express our appreciation. Hence, I would like to invite Honorable Professor Emeritus Tan Sri Dato Zulkifli Abdul Razak, Rector of IIUM, to present a token of our heartiest appreciation to Honorable Dato Sri Anwar Ibrahim and Professor John Esposito. This souvenir presentation marks the end of this auspicious forum. On behalf of the organizer, we would like to express our deepest appreciation once again to the distinguished speakers, guests, and all present. With that note, I bid you good night. Wabillahi taufiq wal hidayah. Wassalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.